Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by CGSP's managing editor, Cobus van Staden, from beautiful Cape Town, South Africa. A very good evening to you, Cobus.
Good evening.
I don't get to say good evening to you very often. I'm coming to you today from California. It's evening time for Cobus in Cape Town. Normally, I'm in Southeast Asia, where it's morning for Cobus, so we're mixing things up here a little bit. Cobus, today we want to step back a little bit from our usual discussion on news and current events and things like that, and to look at the China-Africa energy relationship. We've been talking about this all week in our newsletter and in our various shows about the dramatic surge in Chinese Belt and Road Initiative spending in the first half of 2025. The numbers were astounding. I'm not going to go through all of the numbers because on previous shows we've done this, and also coming up next week on our Global South podcast, we have an interview with Christopher Nedapil from Griffiths University in Australia, where we break down all of the BRI numbers that came out in the first half 2025 report. But one thing I do want to mention is that energy-related engagement. Now, when we talk about engagement, these are investments, these are MOUs. It's a broad basket of deals. Some of them are solid, some of them a little bit not so much, but it is an indicator of the trends. And the trends are all pointing in one direction, and that's up. Chinese energy-related engagement was the highest in any period in the first 6 months of this year, any period throughout the Belt and Road dating back to 2013, reaching $42 billion, which again is a 100% increase over what they did all of last year. And a lot of that is happening in Africa. And there's at least $21 billion of engagement that's happening in Nigeria in particular. Now, this comes on top of more than a decade, maybe even 2 decades of Chinese engagement in the African energy sector. It's a pretty sizable presence. So Chinese-backed projects now account for 23 gigawatts of installed generation capacity across 27 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. That is, just to give you some perspective, nearly 20% of the total. Cobus, you can say a lot of things about what the Chinese have done in Africa. Some of it's good, some of it not so good. But when we talk about 20% of the region's energy capacity for an energy-starved region as Africa is today, that is dramatic.
It really is dramatic. It's in lots of ways, it's transformative, I think. And, you know, it's even more transformative when you put it in context. You were referring to Sub-Saharan Africa. I think there's even been more in North Africa and in the MENA region. There's huge investments in energy, particularly in renewables in places like Saudi Arabia, for example, also. Egypt particularly. And Egypt, we're increasingly also seeing announcements of more solar component manufacturing, even, you know, kind of being discussed. There's a solar glass company, I think, like announced an investment this week in Egypt. So this is all really interesting. I think, what's particularly interesting for me is how rapidly it's suddenly increased. You know, because the last few years, people who've been listening to our podcast for a while will know that over the last few years, the thing we've mostly talked about was a decline in lending. So over right through the pandemic, like in the early 2020s, the main story was that lending across a bunch of different fields from China to Africa is declining. Sudden U-turn, you know, kind of like in the space of about a year, you know, so all of it is really interesting to see in action, and you know, it really is a kind of a testament to the idea that you should never count out the BRI. You know, the BRI will always take a pivot.
Yeah, and when we're talking about Chinese energy engagement in Africa, I think a lot of people may think of oil and gas extraction, coal extraction from places like South Africa or solar power plants, but there's also a lot of activity in the energy infrastructure space. So the Chinese are building a refinery in Angola, for example. They also built a facility in Mombasa a couple of years ago that allows the offloading of refined fuels into the Kenyan energy system. And it's these infrastructure pieces that also make it work. Consider this fact that with the new Dangote refinery in Nigeria that's just come online, Africa, a continent of 1.3 billion people, has only about 50 refineries. And so we have this lunacy situation where African countries are exporting raw crude oil to Europe and to other parts, even to the United States, and then purchasing back that same crude as refined fuels, because they don't have the refining capacity. So this infrastructure piece is also very critical. And to understand what the Chinese are doing in Africa, particularly in the energy sector, we have started this new series that is absolutely fascinating. And it really steps back just in a very basic way to say, here's what's going on. It's a new series called The Porcelain Jar at the End of the Rainbow. We're going to find out why that beautiful title is there. And it's written by CGSP's non-resident fellow for Africa, who is normally based in South Africa, but today joins us from the lovely city of Abuja, Naa Adjekai Adjei, who's also a newly minted doctor with her new PhD in business administration from the University of Cape Town. A very good afternoon to you, Adjekai.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's really lovely to be here.
Yes, we're all over the space
Literally
here
everywhere
today. Wonderful
in the
to have you. We're literally everywhere. It's wonderful to have you back on the show again. First of all, congratulations on your PhD. Just massive kudos. I know how hard you've been working on this over the years, and it's really just a massive accomplishment. So we're just thrilled to be able to share the joy of what you've accomplished, and also want to congratulate you on this new series. Again, it's coming out every 2 weeks on CGSP, and we've already started it. So we've got 3 entries already. We've got it right on our homepage right now. So if you go to cgsp.com, you'll find it on our homepage. If not, click under the analysis tab, or I'll put links in the show notes. Before we get into the details of what you're talking about and why you decided to take this approach on explaining Chinese energy engagement in Africa, maybe we can start with this beautiful title that you came up with, The Porcelain Jar at the End of the Rainbow. What does that mean?
Thanks so much for the congratulations and for having me. It's always lovely to chat to both of you. So in terms of the name, it's essentially a play on the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And essentially, it's supposed to represent the possible value or, well, very obvious value that Chinese investment brings to the African continent. So it basically illustrates a very valuable but possibly essentially fragile opportunity. So Chinese financing of power generation infrastructure projects, they come with great opportunities. Very often the bundled finance, it's done at scale. So that's obviously very valuable, but they're also quite delicate. In that without the right structures, without the oversight and the preparation, the projects can end up as, having cost overruns, time overruns, and that speaks to essentially the fragile nature of porcelain. So essentially it's a play just to represent the value, but also essentially the risks or the challenges that could be associated. But yeah, and mainly the value.
And kind of in against the background of the of this work, what have you been thinking about in terms, like when you were when you saw the reporting around the new data around the Belt and Road and also the kind of rapid increases in some energy engagement?
Mm-hmm. So essentially, when I started putting the series together, what I wanted to do was put together a bite-sized and kind of easily digestible way for people to engage with Chinese investments. So just stepping back, so the series was based very much off my findings in the PhD, and I know nobody has the time to read 80,000 words plus. So when I was thinking of the series, I really wanted it to be a way that most people can engage with the findings and really understand from a more factual and academic perspective what's happening, but put in an engaging way. So it's just really lovely to see that the amount of financing going into energy infrastructure in Africa is actually increasing this year. There was a lull. There's been a lull in the last few years, with 2016, 17 being the peak. So I'm I'm very happy that this series has basically coincided with, the increase in financing going towards power generation infrastructure in Africa. So I don't know, the fates have aligned quite nicely. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so if people are not familiar with the trends of energy financing, try to imagine that in 2010, 12, 13, right before the Belt and Road came, pretty low levels of engagement. 2013, it skyrockets up until about 2016, 2017, as you pointed out, and then starts to make a dramatic fall leading into the pandemic where it really went down to zero. Then 21, 20, actually 22, 23, still pretty low, but on the up. And then here we are in 24, 25, and starting to really head back up strongly again. So that really, coincides with your interest. And the timing of what you're doing is so perfect because, again, we're seeing this renewed interest, but so much of what you're trying to do, as you said, bring a factual understanding to this, seems to be dispelling a lot of the myths or the misperceptions, both by Africans and by other outsiders, to what the Chinese are doing. There also doesn't seem to be a lot of understanding within African policy circles and scholarship circles about the nature of Chinese energy engagement. And that felt like what you were also trying to shed some light on. Maybe talk about the misunderstandings that you were trying to address. Some of it intentional, some of it malign, some of it just very innocent.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's why I said, even with the name, it was just a play on the opportunity, but also kind of the possible tensions or risks that were present. So, yeah, there is definitely just a huge kind of misunderstanding in the generally around China's engagement with Africa, as you said, for a number of reasons. And even the research and how academia looks at it, a big portion of the work done initially was just trying to, for example, get numbers, get accurate figures of how much investment's actually going in. So it was very empirical in nature for a very long time, because both parties, that being the parties from China and the African side, also don't officially publish so much data. And so that's one of the key challenges around understanding these engagements, because both parties are not, yeah, just haven't put as much out there for people to thoroughly and just very clearly get the picture without in-depth research. So that was one of the key reasons and one of the motivations. And in terms of the misunderstandings out there, I think the key one that I'm hoping that the series will dispel is that essentially African countries don't have a role to play in these engagements, and that I really want people to take out of this series and to really understand the role that African governments have to play in shaping it. There is this misconception that China is this monolithic entity that has so much more power than, the African states that it's engaging with for various reasons. And African states that do take on these projects just have no say. And that's something that's quite incorrect. And that's the biggest take home that I really would like people to, have, because it really boils down to shaping and the outcomes of the project. Because if African counterparties don't understand how much agency and how much, shaping of the project they have to do, then it leaves room for the project to actually, you know, take any form, and a form that might not be ideal for that African government. So just understanding that there's, for example, certain aspects of the finance agreements that are extremely flexible, understanding that in terms of project implementation, as much as a lot of the projects are turnkey projects, there's still a role for the government to play in terms of oversight, in terms of project management, etc. So yeah, that's kind of some of the key misunderstandings, and also some of the key takeaways that I'm hoping become clear through this series. Mhm.
There's this issue of the potential for larger government oversight, or like a stronger role for African governments. I think that's really interesting one, and it's frequently, I think, overlooked, among others because a lot of people who are not in the space tend to underestimate the role of like how big a role African governments have in providing social goods. So I was wondering if you could give us some kind of concrete examples, like throughout the kind of project timeline. Which kinds of government interventions are you talking about?
Okay, so thank you. That's a great question, and I'll illuminate a few. One I actually spoke to a little bit just earlier on around the financing agreement. So one of the key things that came out during my field work was just the space and opportunity for negotiating the financing agreement. So generally, if it's a Chinese state-backed agreement being entered into, or financing agreement being entered into with China Exim Bank, there's usually two agreements, financing agreements that come into play. One is more concessional. I'm not going to use like the official terms. I'm just going to explain them so it's easier to digest. But yeah, so one is more concessional and one is more commercial in nature. So in terms of the concessional financing, it forms a part of so basically, you would have the overall EPC cost, the cost of constructing the project, and then the loan would be taken out in two parts: one concessional, one commercial, and essentially there's a split in between. So you can have the concessional part of the loan, which means it's has less interest, it has a longer repayment period, for example. That portion of the loan can be negotiated to a certain extent. So, for example, let's say the government is offered 70% commercial and 30% concessional. That would mean quite an expensive project for the government because the majority of the loan is commercial. But there is leeway to negotiate how much is actually concessional and how much is commercial. So, for example, some countries have had success in negotiating the concessional portion of their loans up, which means that they got essentially more cheaper financing because the concessional part has less interest attached to it. So that's one key aspect that governments need to hold in mind as they are, entering into these loan agreements, because at the end of the day, they need to pay them back. It will be better to pay back a loan with less interest than one with more interest. So aspects like that are very important in shaping how much the project actually costs the country. Another aspect that's really misunderstood or misquoted very often is, resource-backed financing. So that's when countries use a natural resource to pay back a portion of the loan. So a lot of rhetoric is like, China is coming to take Africa's, and then insert resource, whether it's oil, gold, bauxite, cocoa, whatever it might be. And a lot of people who don't understand the structure of these projects are quite, upset about that. But again, in the research, what's come out is that governments actually direct if they're willing to put up a natural resource to, back or to repay this loan. So, for example, in Uganda, which received quite a bit of finance from China to build its largest power plant, the Karuma power plant, the government of Uganda decided that the oil that they had was not part of, the transaction. So as a house view and as a government view, they decided not to put up any natural resource collateral, and that was very intentional. And so they proceeded with the project without any resource as collateral or to repay back the loan. And then comparing it, for example, to Ghana's experience with the Bui Dam, where cocoa was put up. The government of Ghana did that intentionally because they wanted to increase their cocoa exports. They actually wanted to find a new market for cocoa exports. And that's why they were like, China is big, so that would be, a great place to, find a new market. And so, yes, it was part of this infrastructure deal, but it was also the government trying to essentially grow um, that industry. So, really understanding the flexibility and the possibilities in terms of the negotiations for the finance agreements and for the repayments is very important. As I said, resource-backed financing is one that's really very often sorely misquoted. So moving away from the finance, another important aspect would be that, really jumped out was project implementation. We touched on it briefly, but governments really need to be on site as the project is being built and must have the capacity to oversee that. So it's not to say that you have contractors coming on board and so that's that, you're done. Just like any home building project, if you have somebody in coming to fix your plumbing, very often you'll be hovering around, you'll be checking what's going on, you'd be, explaining what it is that you want in detail. So same thing. Not that there's any, direct malicious intent, but just oversight to ensure that the project turns out exactly how you want it is very important. And that's come out in really shaping how quickly the projects are built, how efficiently they're built, and like the quality at which they come if there's really good government oversight. So those are some of the, aspects that the government has a really important role to play in.
Yeah, picking up this thread on the resource-backed loans, also what we've learned from Aid Data's new research is that oftentimes it's not the resource itself, it's the revenue from the resource that serves as the collateral.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of misunderstanding even on that the Chinese are not going to seize the cocoa. They're going to take the revenue from the sale of cocoa in order to pay back that resource-backed loan. I was surprised to find in your research that only 8% of the engagements use these resource-backed loans, because that is entirely disproportionate to the anxiety that we see in Nigeria, in Angola, in many other places. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to why this is. And I don't believe, and maybe this is just my opinion, that it's entirely Western narratives that are fueling this. I think there are deeper anxieties about agency and ownership of resources in African countries, given the trauma that occurred for centuries of Europeans coming and stealing these resources. And so when they see these complex loans that they don't understand, where the revenue from these resources are put up as collateral, for a lot of people, it feels like this is just, here we go again, colonial exploitation all over.
No, I think you're totally very spot on and accurate. I think just also kind of repeating what I'd said earlier, I think also because there's just a lack of information, very clear information about how these deals are structured. As you mentioned, they can be quite complex. So there's usually, a myriad of actors actually taking part in these transactions. So you have the financiers, so you have the banks, you have the government, you also have usually a Chinese off-taker of that kind of resource. So, for example, if it's, cocoa, somebody in China who buys cocoa, for example. So I think just the kind of complicated nature of how the projects are structured, coupled with kind of the lack of information that's coming out on both sides, that can really, trigger, these fears and also get people to think that it's exactly what's happened in the past, even though it's not. It's just not as clear as it should be. And so that understanding of what's going on isn't there.
And Cobus, this ties into something you and I have talked about over the years, how among African publics, and nowhere are we seeing this more than in Nigeria and Kenya today, is their deep suspicion of their own leaderships. And so when they see these complex deals that they don't necessarily understand, that the media struggles to explain, there is a perception that the Chinese are working in collusion with corrupt elites, oftentimes against their interests. So public support for these initiatives, even though they're power and everybody wants power, sometimes is met with suspicion.
Yeah, I think in that respect, I've always found Africa an interesting comparison to East Asia and Southeast Asia, because in a lot of Southeast Asian countries, the government managed to instill a kind of a national narrative of development that has been harder, I think, for some African governments to maintain. So there's a lot, particularly because a lot of these infrastructure projects are development focused. one would think that would be a natural space for this kind of like, shaping of a national shared identity. But of course, national shared identities can be very tricky in Africa because of African history. Adjekai, I was wondering in relation to this, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about renewables within the larger kind of energy space. Like what is the kind of extent now of Africa-China cooperation on solar and wind? And what do you think are some of the barriers that are holding back the kind of that taking on a larger proportion?
Okay. All right. Thank you. That's a really great question, especially because of the leading role that China plays with regards to renewables. So unfortunately, it's not as large as we would like. It is picking up. I think so as many might know is that in 2021, China essentially said it wouldn't fund coal projects overseas going forward, and that was quite important for the African continent because a lot of projects that were being financed previously were coal, and since then that pledge has held true, and there hasn't been any new coal projects taking shape, which it's not like they're directly correlated, but we also see that, there is a lot of space for renewables coming in as well. I think some of the challenges to their growth, because they still represent a relatively small amount, this is non-hydro renewables, we're definitely not where we'd like to be. And I think some of the challenges is kind of, one, the coordination challenges on the financier side around these projects. So essentially, from research, basically China prefers to finance kind of larger scale projects, and these renewable projects in Africa are typically a bit smaller than the usual hundreds of megawatts to gigawatt projects. So just the coordination challenges within the ministry and ministries and myriad of Chinese actors involved to actually get these projects off the ground is one aspect. I think another key challenge that's come up has been also, is it coordination on the African side? One of the key challenges actually also is on the African side is the government guarantees around renewable projects. So those are coming in less and less, very few and far between. And that's something that when China is doing state-backed projects, are preferable. So I think those
I'm sorry, can you just, what do you mean by African guarantees? Could you explain that?
Okay, so basically, essentially in power generation projects, especially on the African continent, there are private sector projects that are being taken up, but essentially the way a lot of power sectors in Africa are structured is that power that's generated is usually in the end sold to a national utility that then distributes to the populace. And a lot of these utilities are insolvent, so they're not doing that well financially, which means it presents a risk, or power producers that are private or people that are giving loans to build these projects see this lack of liquidity of the off-takers to be a risk, obviously, to them regaining the investments made. And so a lot of the time, financiers would like to get a government guarantee to say if this national entity isn't able to repay the loan or doesn't collect enough money, etc., from the sale of electricity, the government, whether it's the Ministry of Finance, for example, would then have that as would guarantee that, and so would step in and repay, the portion of the loan that's due. So essentially, a lot of financiers, etc., coming into Africa's power generation space would like the states to guarantee those funds, and the state is, quite stepping back from doing that because it has a lot of projects that it's guaranteed, and also just has a lot of obligations that it needs to be able to meet. So yeah, basically because of the lack of guarantees, there's also kind of an unwillingness to invest in the sector.
Well, you've talked a lot about the ambitions of African countries to build more power to help fill some of these electricity deficits that are chronic in many countries, Nigeria, South Africa being two good examples of that. What are the motivations of the Chinese? Now, obviously, they want to make money with their contractors to build things, and they want to make some money off of the loans. But talk to us a little bit about the deeper motivations for the Chinese, because you talked about that in one of your columns this week.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for that. I think that's a very important aspect to understand, because I guess before you can understand a project, you need to understand why, both parties are engaging in the project. So, there's essentially two, the data has kind of highlighted two big reasons, and there's a myriad, but the two larger reasons are one, kind of exporting excess capacity. So, um, China's development story is a wonderful one. It was quite slow for a while. It was quite difficult for a while, and then really started taking off, 80s, 90s, and going forward. And that's also kind of had an impact internally. So what we're seeing in China domestically is there's kind of more skill and more capacity than what's needed. So supply is essentially higher than demand. I'm not an economist, but that's essentially what's happening. And because of that, there's more players than can actually, for the more players than jobs. And so China has kind of taken on this going out approach to export this skill, as you said, and also, make some money. So I think that's one of the key motivations. And so that's like a push factor. So that's one aspect that's pushing China out. But then as a kind of meeting China on that is like the pull element from the African side to say we actually don't have enough of this capacity, enough of the skill. So there's, a very complementary kind of engagement that's happening, with China having more than is needed and with Africa having less. And so, it's quite a nice, good opportunity for the two to meet. So one of the key factors, just recapping, is, the overcapacity in China from a skills perspective, even just the amount of power generation infrastructure that's in China. Like, it's grown so astronomically, and there's no longer such a great need. And then the second kind of key motivator has been what we touched on a bit earlier, has been just resources. So being able to find resources to kind of power the, I don't want to say power the Chinese economy, but things like oil that's,
Sure, but it contributes. It's an important part of the Chinese economy.
Exactly. So initially, China was self-sufficient in that aspect, but as it grew, it also needed to get a lot more imports in. Initially, there was a lot of reliance, for example, on oil from Asia, certain parts of Asia, and as that declined, China looked to the Middle East, and then as that again. Not declined, but also, China got bigger and was looking for more resources. And so Africa came in. So just the need for resources, that's a contributing motivator. I think those are the two big ones. Outside, like stepping back from Africa, China's going out has also been initially motivated by, trying to get exposure to kind of not new technologies, but, exposure to new technologies and skills, etc. But that's related to more of the developed world and not so much with China's motivation for being, funding projects in Africa. Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned that the logic of the title is that there is this opportunity at the end of the rainbow, but it is a fragile opportunity, and and we're seeing a moment where China is facing a lot of trade barriers in the global north. It has huge amounts of solar panels and stuff. It's making more than it can use domestically. So there is this space in a very energy poor, environment like Africa. There's the combination seems clear, right? It seems like kind of like a no-brainer. But at the same time, as you're saying, there's a lot of actual barriers. So I was wondering if you were advising African stakeholders to how could they safeguard and grasp this opportunity more effectively? What would be some of the on the ground changes that you would suggest that African stakeholders can implement on their side to make it easier to take advantage of this opportunity?
Okay. That's a great one. I think the first step would be preparation. And I think there's a saying that goes prior preparation prevents poor performance, something along those lines. And not to say that African governments don't prepare, but I think there's a lot more groundwork that can be done in just the very early stages. So, for example, if you look at the master plans and essentially the plans that African governments have with relation to their power sectors. Very often these plans aren't very accurate from a financial perspective. They're usually not kept up to date. I mean, some countries are using master plans from 2010. That's not very it's just not keeping up with the times. Not just trends, but needs have changed, prices have changed, so much has changed in these last, for example, 15 years that, these power plans are no longer accurate and they're not least cost plans. They don't reflect the most effective way to actually bring power online. So that prior preparation, I think, is very important, just, from just the initial step. And then I think another thing that's quite important would be just building capacity. I think the most important part from, picking up in the research was that capacity in the actual project implementation stage, because that's the riskiest stage and that's the most, the construction stage. So that's the riskiest stage and that's the most expensive stage. So actually having kind of a large complement of government staff that are very, very, very comfortable with actually building this large scale infrastructure, that have that experience, whether it's, experience from building, domestically or even from overseas. I think that was the case, for example, in Uganda. They had a head engineer that came in that had, 20 years experience just, building similar projects. And I think that's a key thing, because there's a lot of, for example, very short trainings of 2 weeks that a lot of people, go to. And that's not the kind of capacity and skill that is needed to oversee, such a large scale project. So actually, the two, they link very closely, and it's just around just very good planning, very good project preparation, just to ensure that, you can get the project that would most effectively serve your country.
It's interesting that you bring this up, because one of the pieces of feedback that I get from some of my contacts at the China Exim Bank is their complaints that the feasibility studies for projects that come in from African governments are substantially weaker than those from other parts of the world. And there's a frustration within the Chinese development finance community that these feasibility studies aren't stronger. They want to find bankable projects, but they're also, if they can't do anything, if they're getting 2010 data and they're getting old projects and these feasibility studies are not very tight. And one of the things that again, a couple of my contacts at China Exim Bank have said over the years is that in this more austere time that we live in, when China isn't throwing cash out the way that they did, that African governments are competing now against dozens of other governments around the world, in Southeast Asia, in South America, and others. And there is a competition in the quality of the feasibility study. So if a better pitch comes in, and it's easier for the Exim Bank loan officers to understand and to be able to process and move through their system because it's written in accordance with China Exim Bank protocols, and another one comes in that's sloppy, that's outdated, that's not detailed, it just makes it harder. No matter how much they may want to work with African governments, it just makes it more difficult. And this brings up kind of one of my last questions for our conversation today is you've talked a lot about the Chinese, and I'm wondering in your research, both for this project and also for your PhD, how do the Chinese compare to, say, what the Americans are doing with Power Africa or with what other foreign actors are doing in Africa to be able to provide project financing for energy initiatives? Obviously, it seems like a lot when we say 20% and of the total installed capacity was done by the Chinese. But how does it measure against, say, what the Americans, the British, Germans, Japanese are doing?
Mm. So I feel like as you were speaking, I was nodding my head like a bubble doll, and my head could have fallen off. It's just how much is like agreeing with what you were saying, but you'd really raised a great point around, like you were saying, the the feasibility studies, and that's one of the studies that I actually worked on. We looked at, establishing a pre-feasibility financing facility to actually help developers. It wasn't, targeted at governments, but it was targeted more at private sector for developers to actually have the support and capital to be able to put together bankable projects, because just stepping back from China, that's actually one of the key challenges that, the continent's having overall, just having a
That's right.
pipeline.
For anybody, it's not just the
Yeah,
Chinese. You need to put good
yeah.
feasibility
No,
studies
exactly.
together for any investor.
No, exactly. So it's just this lack of bankable projects. Not that there's money to actually finance the projects if you can show that the projects are bankable, if you can show that you've done the pre-studies, you've done the financial modeling and all the rest, and the project actually looks like it's feasible. So yeah, that's a key part of research we did in a separate study. And it's something that the last time I was involved in the study, we were actually looking at Chinese counterparties that we could share this with to say, okay, let's take a step back. Actually, before the project, we think that there's this lacuna where, support is needed to ensure that, actually a, a bankable project pipeline is built. So yeah, that explains my bubble heading whilst you were speaking.
Fair enough.
Um,
And about the how does and just very quickly, how does what the Chinese doing compared to that of and even other even intra-regional actors within Africa in terms of energy financing?
Yeah, yeah. So that's a great question. So in my research, what I looked at and what I can cite or know well is just Chinese financing versus private sector financing. So not really stratified at a country level, but to say, stepping back from um, not what government's doing, but what the private sector is doing. And it's very interesting that Chinese finance overall, so state-backed finance, as well as private Chinese finance versus private finance of everybody, let's say it that way, are basically on par across the continents. They both provide about 20% of the power generation capacity on the continent, which is very important to, it really contextualizes just the huge role that, one, China's playing, and also two, just seeing that, something that usually strictly lay within the purview of African governments is almost now 50% being, provided by somebody else. And that's quite important to just understand and grasp. And as you're saying now, we need to start thinking about how are we shaping that and what does that mean for the continent. But yeah, just going back to your question, private sector versus Chinese investment, pretty much at par, both at about 20% each, contributing to the continent's or Sub-Saharan Africa's power generation capacity.
So, just kind of going back to the pre-feasibility study that you were mentioning, following that logic, like was there interest on the Chinese side for for setting up this kind of initiative, and what would the next steps be essentially?
Yeah. So when we initially did that research, we did it for a set of DFIs on the continent. And unfortunately, at the time, the DFIs didn't have money to dedicate towards setting up, this pre-feasibility financing facility. And
And
so,
DFIs, you mean development finance
yes,
institutions, right?
development
Okay.
finance institutions on the continent. So not the World Bank, for example, but, local development finance institutions. So yeah, I think at that time, the DFIs just had a number of kind of competing interests of where they could channel their funds. And so we couldn't get that to lift off there. But we did then approach various counterparties from the Chinese side who were interested. I think there was going to be a follow-on study. But unfortunately, I'm no longer at the institution that was doing that. So I can't give too many updates. Yeah. But it
Okay,
was
very
looking good. And at the stage that I left the project, there was a lot of interest from the Chinese side. I think, yeah.
okay. So just to kind of sum up everything that we've been talking about, what do you want people to take away from this series? I mean, it's an ongoing series, and we're going to be doing it for the rest of the year. So we're going to have a lot to talk about. And by the way, we're going to turn these articles that you're generating, we're going to turn them into an ebook. And we want to make it more easily accessible for people to be able to package them up. And we're also going to have a China-Africa Energy Forum that Cobus is going to host later this year, because it ties in with our new China-Africa Energy Map that we have. So a lot going on in this energy space, but a lot of information. You're providing this great kind of breakdown. What do you want people to take away from these articles?
Thank you. Yeah, so I think the key thing that I want people to take away, it's not a specific theme or a specific message, but I think I just want there to be hopefully a lot more clarity about what's going on. I think I would like conversations of the general public to be a lot more factual. There was a stage where I actually didn't like speaking about my research because it would just it would just explode with many things that weren't entirely correct. So I think my key aim is just having people really having a more in-depth and a more factual and a more neutral understanding, right? Because I think when you understand something, you're able to engage with it more effectively. And so it's just building that base level of understanding for people to engage so that these projects can um, actually benefit who they're supposed to benefit a lot more. And so that, we can increase the number of projects that are coming in because, we have the SDG goals 2030. 2030 is very close by, and we still have about 60% of the continent still in the dark. So I think really understanding every source that's available to you to be able to bridge this gap is so important. And that's why I wanted to put it in shorter formats and more digestible formats and more engaging formats. There's this baseline understanding, whether it's policymakers, government workers, whoever it may be, average person can really just engage with the projects and, have them take off.
Yeah, well, that's why you are a perfect fit for the China Global South Project, because that's what we do as well. Dr. Naa Adjekai Adjei, does that sound weird, by the way?
It does.
Okay, well, it's well-deserved. Dr. Naa Adjekai Adjei is CGSP's non-resident fellow for Africa based in Abuja. And again, congratulations on your PhD from the University of Cape Town. She's producing an indispensable series, The Porcelain Jar at the End of the Rainbow. Again, links are in the show notes. The latest installment of that series that will be coming out every 2 weeks for the rest of the year. Motives That Matter, the economic and strategic logic behind China's power sector engagement in Africa. The way that Adjekai has been writing this, it's very accessible, very easy to understand. It's not the boring academic, wonky kind of PhD writing. So we're very happy that we're not reading your 80,000 word PhD, because the way you've presented it here is wonderful. And congratulations on both the PhD and this wonderful series. And we're looking forward to having you join us later this summer for our China-Africa Energy Forum that we're going to be doing virtually. It'll be live on YouTube, live on Facebook, LinkedIn, to be able to take these conversations that you're raising in your series and in your dissertation, be able to bring it to a larger audience. So we really appreciate it. Thank you for your time today, Adjekai.
All right. Thank you so very much. It's always so lovely to catch up and to just talk about this. So thank you.
Cobus, I am just so happy that we're running Adjekai's series on the site, because it very much fits with our motivations at CGSP, which is to bring fact-based understanding to some of these very complex issues that often get distorted in the media and in the larger discourse, sometimes through mis and disinformation, but sometimes just because of, again, we talked about historical trauma, because of a lack of capacity, because of a lack of training. These contracts are very complicated and confusing. But I do have to say that the problem is compounded by the fact that we never hear from the Chinese side on this. All of these discussions, even the ones that we're having, only take part among Africans and foreigners like me. And it's kind of frustrating that we just don't have Chinese experts weighing in and saying, here's what we're doing, this is why we're doing it. And we've all kind of accepted it as a reality of the world we live in, that the Chinese don't participate in these discussions. But it's incredibly frustrating. You know, almost every single show that we publish on YouTube, almost without fail, we get, why don't you have Chinese experts on? Why do you only have Africans or white people or whatever? And I get really frustrated with these comments because I understand where they're coming from, because I'm frustrated by that. But we can't get any Chinese experts to weigh in on this. It's hard for African researchers to get the Chinese to speak. They're just reluctant to do so. They don't want to. And I mean, it's hard, but that's a big missing piece in all of this.
It is, and I think it's, you know, it affects us, but I think it's increasingly affecting other you know, kind of sectors as well. Because of course, you know, increasingly the Chinese academic system is decoupling from the rest of the world. It's not only that the experts themselves don't really have any kind of career boosting reasons to speak to kind of outfits like us, but it's also that increasingly it's very difficult to actually even get an eye on research outputs, you know, kind of coming from China, because a lot of those systems are being pulled away from global systems. And, you know, at the same time, this is happening, obviously, as there's increasing kind of government pressure on Chinese grad students. There's increasing pressure on Chinese programs in universities and so on. So it's a narrowing space.
Yeah.
And, you know, you can see why people don't want to engage with the media, because it frequently kind of like brings them more trouble than it's worth.
That's right. I mean, and again, I understand oftentimes where the Chinese are coming from on these issues, because as you pointed out, a lot of times when they do engage with the media, the message gets distorted and it doesn't end up well for them. That being said, I think part of the reason why they run into so much opposition, misunderstanding, and complications in places like Africa is because they don't have stakeholders who are coming out to speak with people like us or Adjekai. And it's just really frustrating. The other thing that came to mind as I was thinking about our conversation with Adjekai was the research that Folashade Sule did at Oxford University, talking about the competence of African negotiators that oftentimes varies dramatically even within a single country. That those negotiating teams that have higher skills better understand the Chinese, better understand what their own needs are, and then can articulate those in these feasibility studies, tend to deliver more optimized results. So I think pairing Folashade's research with what Adjekai is writing, I highly recommend. I'm going to put a link to some of what Folashade has done in the show notes as well, because I think those are really, they work in tandem with one another.
One of the interesting things that Folashade pointed out in some of her work is that it's more effective when you have a whole of government approach. You know, when you're approaching a Chinese project like across different ministries, rather than just having it located in one ministry or in one working group, where you're actually pulling competence from other departments, it ends up being more effective. And of course, you know, that itself depends on coordination and what the kind of human capacity that is available, you know, to these coordinators. But still, it is, you know, kind of it needs to be a shared project rather than a siloed one. And I think, you know, kind of fighting the siloing of these projects and the siloing of Africa-China relations itself is, you know, it's a bigger job, I think.
Yeah. And it also brings up this question of the distortions in the discourse So we run into this quite a bit looking at this space. So for a lot of people, they think, for example, that China is the dominant mining actor in Africa and that China, exploits African resources at levels far higher than others because they're in the headlines quite a bit, when in fact, the total output of Chinese mining from all of Africa is less than 10%. And then when we also talk about, the debt issues, again, Chinese account for a very small share of the total public debt in Africa. Many African countries borrow 50% or more domestically from their own people, significantly more from private creditors. Again, this is not to kind of sugarcoat some of the problems in Chinese lending in Africa, specifically related to transparency. But it is to say that it's about, I think, 11 to 12% now of the total. And so when Adjekai wrote that, these resource for infrastructure deals are only 8%, you're like, wow, because that is not at all aligned with the narrative that we read in the newspaper, where you hear over and over and over again that these resource for infrastructure deals are the problem. And they're only 8% of the total. And that I thought was very, very surprising.
Yeah, 8% and decreasing rapidly, because everyone wants to get out of resource-backed loans.
Yeah. The one thing we didn't talk about, which I think is very interesting, and I just want to draw people's attention to. So we talked about these RFI deals, resource for infrastructure deals, also the concessional and market rate loans. That's the traditional lending. What a lot of African governments are doing is engaging the Chinese on what's called a PPP, a public-private partnership. So we saw this with the Nairobi Expressway in Kenya, where it was built by the China Road and Bridge Corporation in over a 27-year period. They're going to recoup that loss. Power projects are very well suited for PPP because the moment you flip the switch on this power station, it starts to generate revenue that can be repaid. And so that is very, very important to be able to look at in the future going forward, are these PPP deals. And I think we're going to see a lot more of those in renewable as well, because you have a lower cost for installation for solar power, for example. You can get something going in 18 months, and it can generate revenue right away.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, what that then raises is some of the issues that, as Adjekai was saying, like a lot of African utility companies, state-owned utilities, have a lot of issues. And one problem is, there's a lot of structural problems, but one big one is that it's hard sometimes to do the revenue kind of collecting. In South Africa has a lot of issues around municipalities, for example, that owe the state utility a lot of money, and where this kind of like debt relationship is now kind of calcified, into a situation where to cut off that municipality, that because they owe so much money, ends up being a very disruptive and politically toxic thing to do. So there is some kind of like embedded political problems in the electricity space in Africa that complicate some of these issues. And so, so like kind of finding the political will to deal with some of these issues and finding ways of making it not turn into an immediately a kind of a toxic political football is part of the challenge, I think, that African governments face.
So Adjekai is one of our 3 fellows that we have this year. We have other fellows in Central Asia and also in Latin America. They're doing amazing work. If you go to our website, you'll see a tag on their work called Fellows, and you can then see all of the great work that they're doing. Yunus Sharifli is in Central Asia, and Alonso Ayuka is in Panama, writing on Central and South American issues. We're hoping to also get a fellow out in Southeast Asia next year as well. So they're doing some fantastic work, and this again highlights the amazing contributions that all of these contributors are doing around the world for CGSP to do what Adjekai said, which is to bring a fact-based, agenda-free understanding of these very complicated topics. I mean, there's no doubt this is complicated, but you'll see the way that Adjekai presents these arguments in such a digestible, accessible way that it makes it easy to understand. And I cannot recommend it enough, from what Adjekai is doing and Yunus as well as Alonso. So, Cobus, thank you so much for taking the time out of your evening to join us. I can see by the light in the back. I'm not used to seeing it so dark for you in Cape Town, but we'll be back. Not next week. We're going to take a week off next week for a little summer break in the show. And then the following week, we'll be back with another episode of the China in Africa podcast. In the meantime, I hope you'll check out some of the other shows that we're producing. Our China Global South show is available now, also on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And don't miss the Africa EV show that our colleague Njenga Hakina is producing out of Nairobi. Fascinating show, getting a lot of traction, a lot of buzz. So I hope you'll take a listen to that. So for Cobus, Njenga, Lucy, Giraud, Alonso, Adjekai, Eunice, the whole CGSP team around the world, I want to thank you for listening and for watching. Until next time, I'm Eric Olander for Cobus Van Staden in Cape Town. We'll be back soon with another episode. Thanks so much for watching and listening.